When we got home, Auntie Myrtle was baking some cakes for tea, and that were good. But before we got tea, Grandad told Mum what he had fixed the scales we kept in the bog, and Mum went to test them, and shouted that he hadn't fixed them because she weren't that heavy and they was wrong. But Grandad said that they weren't wrong, they was right, and that Mum must have put on some weight. But she said they was wrong, and that's that. I said what there was not wrong in being fat. Grandad was fat, and Uncle Ted was fat, and Dad were getting fatter, so it doesn't matter if Mum were fat as well, and that was probably because she ate too much, and she shouldn't worry. And she'd clip me round the ear, it weren't fair. Grandad told me off and said Mum weren't fat. She might be big, like, a bit on the plump side, but she definitely weren't fat, except around the middle. And Dad said that's right, but her hips were big as well, so she were in proportion, so never mind. Mum went bonkers. Auntie Myrtle served up the cakes, and they was good, and we wanted more, and we wanted cream to go on top of the cakes, and sugar to go on the cream, and Grandad said he wanted a burger. Dad said he wanted chips as well, but Mum said right, and when she said right in that tone of voice, we knew there was going to be trouble. We are going to start eating proper, Mum suddenly shouted. Grandad said, that's good, I'll have 2 burgers then, and Grandad got on the phone and ordered 6 pizzas, and settled back to watch the match. But Mum were on the warpath. I don't mean more food, I mean better food, healthy food, food what makes us fit. And we said, what's that then? Just then, Granny turns up in an ice cream van what she had picked up on the high street, and we all dive out and stuff ourselves before the police get here. But Mum was serious. The next morning breakfast were rotten. Eggs and bacon and fried bread and beans and chips and tea and toast were what we always had, but there wasn't any, just a big orange. And I said, what was it? And Mum said it were a grapefruit, and we had to cut it in half and eat it, and it were posh and just get it down you. So we cut the grapefruits in half, and they squirted everywhere. We both got sticky, and you said you got the small half, but I said there was no such thing as a small half, because 2 halves are the same. But you said they weren't halves anyway, and I'd cut it wrong, and so we fought. Then Grandad spat his dentures out and threw his head about and shouted it was sour, and Mum said it was healthy and put some sugar on it then. So we covered the grapefruits in sugar, but Dad said he couldn't go to work on a bloomin' grapefruit. But Mum said what did he do at work anyway? He just hung around. And what was wrong with her hips? And what was the new secretary like? And Dad said he hadn't noticed really, but Mum said he must have noticed because it was Gladys from around the corner who was the new secretary, and she were blonde and young and all dressed up like a tart and skinny. And you said you wanted a tart, and Uncle Ted said he wanted one too. Then Dad wanted tea, but Mum said we weren't having tea and get out. It weren't right. We stuffed ourselves at school all day and loaded up on sweets on the way home, and we were right, because when we got back, Mum had cleaned the kitchen out and there was nothing in the fridge to eat, nothing sweet and sticky and proper anyway, just plants and leaves and green stuff. When Dad came back and looked in the fridge, he said, what the heck is it? And Mum said, it's cabbages and lettuces, and didn't he know what a bloomin' cabbage was? And we were having it for dinner, and it were organic. And you said, what's organic? And I said it was something that was alive and fresh and tasty, and Dad mumbled something about Gladys from around the corner, but what the cabbage word's organic. And Mum heard him, and there were a rumpus. And that was just the start. This is healthy, said Mum, and produced a bag of seeds. Them seeds, I said. What's for birds? But it wasn't seeds, said Auntie Myrtle. It was rice, and rice was healthy, and Indians ate it. And you said the cowboys beat the Indians, so being healthy wasn't good. But Auntie Myrtle said not them kind of Indians. She meant Indians from India what meditated and stood on their heads. What's meditation, you asked, because you didn't know. Auntie Myrtle said it was going to sleep sitting up, and we said we did that in school anyway, so we must be healthy, and why can't we have chips? But Mum said that chips weren't vegetables and we were vegetarian now, so that was that and get out. Mum read a recipe and said it says to use rocket in the salad. I said what that were just stupid, but Auntie Myrtle said that rocket were French food, but we didn't have any anyway, so not to bother. But Granny got a gleam in her eye, and you could see that she had got something in her head, what were worrying. Dinner were horrible. It was just a pile of mashed leaves. You started to cry. What's that? Said Dad, looking at the leaves. Spinach, said Mum. It's healthy. Popeye ate it. But I said Popeye ate proper spinach, what came from a can. And Grandad said that's right. And Mum said she didn't need his opinion, so everybody was quiet, and we just sat and looked at the horrible spinach. That's it, said Dad. We're going out. Granny screams, I'll sort it, leapfrogs over the table, dives out of the window and somersaults down the lane. She were insane. Mum sent you and me out to wash, and we washed, but we got sent to wash again because we hadn't washed properly the first time, just got wet. And when we washed proper, I accidentally pushed you into the shower, and you squirted soap in my eye, and we fought and got soaked all over again, and Mum went bonkers. Auntie Myrtle and Mum got dressed up proper, and Uncle Ted polished up his wooden leg. Dad were too rumpled to go out, Mum said, and he had to iron his suit, but he made it worse and burnt it, and Auntie Myrtle had to do it for him while he caught up with a match. To cheer Mum up, Grandad said that Mum looked nice in her dress, and to cheer her up as well, I said she didn't look fat either, unless she turned sideways, and she were gonna hit me. But just then, we could hear an engine roaring, and could hear Granny shouting outside, and we could tell by the noise of the engine that she had got something sorted. and it were big. "Look what I got!" Granny bawls over the roar of the engine, leaning out of the cabin and waving her hook in excitement. We just looked at the truck what Granny was driving. It were huge. And that weren't all. It had something on the back what was covered with a tarpaulin and looked like a rocket. "What's the bloomin' problem?" shouted Granny, and spat on the mirror and rubbed it with her hair. She were disgusting when she were excited. "Where did you get it?" Mum shouted up to Granny, but Granny were revving up and pushing buttons and pulling levers, and the thing it were carrying on the back slowly started standing up, and we shouted at Granny to stop pushing buttons, and we all climbed up into the cab, and we headed into town where we was going to eat proper. The cab were fantastic, all lights and dials and stuff. It were like a spaceship. And you could see why Granny wanted to push buttons. Everybody did. And there was levers and knobs and switches and buttons and things to turn and poke, and Mum found the radio, and there was a man saying what the Air Force had a rocket stolen and it was serious and they wanted it back. But Granny, she wanted rock and roll, and Grandad wanted to listen to the cricket. Auntie Myrtle wanted gossip, and Mum wanted Engelbert Humperdinck, and we all laughed because he had such a stupid name, but Mum said it weren't stupid and shut up. Dad wanted to listen to the football, so we shouted and fought until we got into town, and Granny were cackling and swerving all over the road. Dad said, "That's it, we're going to have burgers," and we all cheered, but we was attracting attention and people was waving and yelling, and we thought they were warning us about Granny, but then we looked out of the back window and the tarpaulin fallen off, and it was a rocket, and it stood up all gleaming with blooming great fins and all silver and black and pointed and looking mean, and it was steaming and it were huge. Mum said, "There's a ruddy great rocket stood up on the back." "Won't be a real rocket," Grandad said. "It's probably just advertising something." Then police cars started coming from all directions, blowing their sirens and blocking our way. But Dad said to carry on because he wanted a burger. I found a screwdriver under the seat and unscrewed something to fix it, and Sparks jumped out and zapped the cat. I had zapped him before by accident and he went black, so we decided not to call him Ginger anymore. But he were all singed and bad-tempered and started clawing the seat. "He wants a burger as well," said Dad. Grandad put him out of the window because he smelt of burnt fur, and he clambered up the rocket and sat on the top, looking down at the police cars and excitement, like he were a king. But then he came down and climbed back in the cab, and all his hair had fallen off, and he was glowing, and something in the cab started ticking, and it were a box with a label on it, and the label said Geiger counter. Dad said that were German, so it didn't mean nothing. Then helicopters came and hovered over us, and some tanks came, and Granny was cackling and swerving around and spatching things up, and people were running around and pointing and screaming. "I don't know," said Auntie Myrtle, getting on with her knitting. "This used to be such a quiet little town." "I blame the people," said Grandad, and threw the cat out of the window again. We could see the burger bar ahead, and Granny headed straight at it. Then soldiers ran in the way and held up a banner what read, "Don't push the red button." Then they ran out of the way because Granny didn't stop. "There isn't a red button," said Dad. "What are they on about?" But Mum found a flap on the dashboard that were marked danger, and she opened it, and there was a big red button. "Is this what they mean?" she said, and poked it with her finger. There was the biggest bang you ever heard, and everything lit up, and the truck swayed about, and the rocket on the back had gone off. The police and soldiers and everybody looked up, watching the rocket go up, and there was smoke everywhere, so Granny screams, "Let's split," and dives out of the cab. We follow her quickly, and before anybody notices, we get into the burger bar, and it smelt fantastic, but there was police and soldiers and people running around looking right alarmed, and the television was on, and it was all about the rocket, and it had pictures of it, and they showed it on the radar screen, and they said they was trying to shoot it down, so it wasn't just an advertisement after all. But we couldn't get served what with all the bother, so Granny went out and picked up a tank from the army, and we went home in that, but back home it was miserable because all we had to eat was that rotten spinach.